Hej och välkomna till BörsRonden vecka 40 där vi den här veckan ska vända oss mer mot det medicinska hållet än det finansiella. Vi ska ta lite rygg på förra veckans diskussion om Alzheimer-läkemedlet Lekembis marknadsgodkännande i Japan och prata Alzheimers helt enkelt. And to do that, I will switch languages, which is presumably good for the brain, and I will introduce BioStock's very own neuroscientist, Michael Jewett.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Cecilia, and talk a little bit about the brain and why Alzheimer's disease is such a tough disease.
Well, I think everyone knows that this is one of the hottest areas in drug development in the past couple of years, and we've seen huge advancements, not only from Eisai and Biogen that we talked about in relation to Lekembi, but there's also the drug Alzheimer that's received accelerated approval.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot going on right now. You mentioned Lekembi being developed by Eisai and Biogen. That was originally discovered by BioArctic right here in Sweden. And if we mention some other companies here in Sweden, we have Alzinova and also Alzecure, which are making headways in clinical development.
And I feel I should say something about finances just because we are called BörsRonden, and you can see that these advancements, they have made a mark on these companies' share price, but over time it's obviously hard to know how it's going to play out. But you could see, for example, in May of this year when Eli Lilly came with a positive phase 3 readout, they traded at an all-time high. Same thing happened for BioArctic with their positive phase 3 readout. So things are happening, but if we're looking a little bit more at the medical side, which is your area, if we start with the basics, what happens in the brain when you get Alzheimer's?
Well, the incredible thing about the brain is that it's composed of billions of cells, and they all communicate to each other with chemicals called neurotransmitters. And what happens in Alzheimer's disease is you have this abnormal clumping up of protein in between the cells that disrupts that communication. And so these cells, over time, they break down. And it's a progressive disease. So first, the memory center of the brain starts to go, but then over time, the whole brain is affected, and eventually it kills you.
So the body or the brain simply forgets how to keep the body alive.
Pretty much, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, that's of course a terrifying prospect, and this is a very difficult and a very complex disease. But you could say so is cancer. It's a very complex and difficult disease, and there are treatments. But what is it about Alzheimer's that makes it so difficult to figure out?
Well, one of the main things is diagnosing the disease. You start to get symptoms of Alzheimer's disease much after the actual pathophysiology of disease kicks in. The neurons start to be affected even decades before you start to get symptoms.
So you are heading towards Alzheimer's long before you notice it yourself.
Exactly. And so there's still no way to actually diagnose the disease super early on, although I will mention one thing later on. But the other thing is there's a lack of understanding around the mechanisms of action during the disease. For example, we know that proteins come together and they clump together inside the brain, but it's not just one protein, it's more than one protein. And how do these proteins, what is it that causes these proteins to clump together? We don't know those mechanisms exactly. So that makes it very difficult to develop a treatment for Alzheimer's disease.
But now, well, in the past there's been a couple of famous failures within this area, which for a while seemed to put the pharma industry off Alzheimer's slightly. But now we've seen somewhat of a change with these even approved drugs. So what is it that the researchers and pharma companies have figured out now that we didn't know before?
Well, I mentioned those proteins that clump up together. One of them is called amyloid beta. You mentioned Lekembi. This drug attacks amyloid beta. It's an antibody that attacks amyloid beta, and it clears it. For now, Lekembi is the only approved treatment for Alzheimer's disease proven to slow down the progression of the disease. There are other drugs like Aduhelm, you mentioned Aduhelm, but also Eli Lilly's donanemab. They also attack the amyloid beta protein. So researchers are onto something here. But as I mentioned, it's not just amyloid beta. There's more work that needs to be done.
Because you should also attack it from the diagnostic point of view, I guess, and not just the treating point of view.
Exactly. So the diagnostics, I think, is a huge issue. The earlier you find a disease and attack the disease, the better the treatments are going to be.
So just to finish up then with a very easy question. In your opinion, are we now close to solving Alzheimer's?
Mm-hmm. I wish I could be more optimistic on this. We've taken huge steps forward with these approvals. We are seeing quite significant impact on patients with these drugs. However, the burden of Alzheimer's disease is still a major burden. It will continue to be a major burden, especially until we can find a better way to diagnose the disease earlier. But speaking of that, there's a lot happening here in Lund, actually. There's a research group at Lund University that has developed an algorithm that can combine a simple blood test with memory tests and then accurately predict who is more likely to get Alzheimer's in the future. Like I said, the earlier you find a disease, the better it is to find a treatment.
And we've already seen one Nobel Prize go to Lund University this week. Maybe there's potential for another one.
I definitely see a trend here with Lund University, so fingers crossed.
Thank you, Mike. Och det skulle ju inte kännas rätt att avsluta BörsRonden utan en snabb titt på veckans hittills. Det är torsdag eftermiddag när vi spelar in det här. Hittills bästa Life Science-aktier. På tredje plats har vi RLS Global som är upp runt 23%. Andra plats Isofol Medical runt 35%. Och allra bäst har det gått hittills för LSR Therapeutics som är upp runt 41%. Med det tackar vi er för att ni har tittat på BörsRonden denna veckan och vi är tillbaka igen nästa fredag precis som vanligt. Glöm inte att gilla programmet, följ oss på YouTube och slå gärna på aviseringar så att ni inte missar när vi publicerar något.
Did you know that the sun always shines in Lund? At least we hope it will on October 25th, 26th, when it's time again for the BioStock Life Science Summit here at Medicon Village. Join us then for a full 2-day in-person event where we'll have more than 40 companies presenting their business cases, as well as expert insights with big pharma representatives, VCs and investors talking about financing and deal-making in the Nordics. Last year there was a waiting list, so don't forget to register today to secure your spot at this year's BioStock Life Science Summit.